They say the most dangerous moment in any city isn't the sound of chaos. It's the second before someone realizes they made a mistake they can't undo. The morning in downtown Houston looked ordinary on the surface, sunlight bouncing off glass buildings, traffic moving in steady rhythm, pedestrians rushing like every other weekday. But at the center of it all, something was already off balance. Officer Ryan Mitchell stepped out of his patrol unit with the kind of confidence that comes from years of never being questioned, his eyes locking onto a single figure standing near the crosswalk, a black woman in a simple dark jacket, calm posture, unreadable expression, as if she wasn't part of the noise around her. To Ryan, she looked like a problem waiting to be corrected. To everyone else, she looked like nothing at all. But Ava Johnson had always mastered the art of being seen without being understood. Ryan approached without hesitation, his voice sharp enough to cut through the morning air, ordering her to comply with instructions she hadn't violated, demanding control over a situation that didn't require it. People nearby slowed down, phones subtly rising, capturing the moment the way people always do when authority collides with uncertainty. Ava didn't argue, didn't step back, didn't even match his tone. She simply looked at him with a stillness that didn't belong in someone supposedly under suspicion. That stillness bothered him more than resistance would have. He tightened the situation further, insisting on compliance, insisting on dominance, as if certainty alone made him correct. But Ava's silence wasn't submission, it was calculation. Beneath her sleeve, a small smartwatch pulsed once, then again, subtle, intentional, like a heartbeat only she could hear. Somewhere far beyond the city blocks, a signal had just been acknowledged. Ryan continued speaking, unaware that every second he extended this moment was building towards something he could not see. The crowd shifted slightly, tension forming not from what was happening, but from what wasn't being explained. Ava's gaze drifted briefly past him, not toward escape, but toward distance, like she was measuring time. Instead of fearing it, Ryan mistook it for defiance. He stepped closer, demanding identification again, insisting the world bend into clarity that favored his judgment. And still, Ava did not raise her voice. Instead, she spoke just one quiet sentence meant only for herself, something no one else fully understood in the moment, something that sounded almost like confirmation rather than response. In the background, somewhere between the hum of traffic and the distant sirens of an unrelated call, a subtle shift began, barely noticeable, but real. A black SUV slowed half a block away, then another, positioned without urgency, without announcement. Ryan didn't notice. He was too focused on winning a moment that was already leaving him behind. Ava finally met his eyes again, not with fear, not with anger, but with recognition, like she was waiting for something to arrive rather than something to end. And as the first hint of that arrival began to change the atmosphere around them, the question wasn't whether this situation would escalate, but who had actually been in control of it from the very beginning. And the answer was already moving closer, unseen, unstoppable, and about to rewrite everything Ryan thought he understood about the woman standing in front of him. The city felt quieter in the seconds that followed, as if the air itself was holding its breath without permission, and Officer Ryan Mitchell noticed none of it. His attention remained locked on the woman in front of him, the same woman who had not reacted the way anyone else would have under pressure. Around them, pedestrians had slowed to an almost unnatural stillness, phones lifted higher, recording not just an interaction, but a moment that felt heavier than it should have been. Ryan repeated his command again, more firmly this time, his voice shaped by certainty rather than doubt, insisting that she comply immediately, as though repetition alone could turn authority into truth. Ava Johnson finally shifted her stance slightly, not in retreat, but in acknowledgement of the situation unfolding around her, her eyes scanning briefly past Ryan's shoulder toward the street where the black SUVs had now positioned themselves with quiet precision. No sirens, no urgency, just presence. The kind of presence that does not announce itself because it does not need to. Ryan noticed nothing yet, still focused on control, still convinced that escalation equaled dominance. A nearby bystander whispered under their breath, uncertain if what they were witnessing was routine procedure or something else entirely. Ava remained silent, allowing the silence itself to grow heavier, like it was being measured by unseen hands. Ryan took another step closer, attempting to close distance, attempting to force clarity where there was none, but Ava's expression did not change. It stayed steady, almost reflective, as if she were observing him more than he was observing her. That detail unsettled him without explanation. He adjusted his posture, insisting again on identification, on compliance, on order, but the rhythm of the moment had already shifted away from him. In the reflection of a nearby storefront window, faint movement could be seen behind Ryan. Figures stepping out of vehicles without urgency, positioning themselves with quiet coordination. Ava's wrist device pulsed once more, subtle but intentional, as if confirming timing rather than requesting assistance. She exhaled slowly, barely noticeable, and for the first time Ryan hesitated for a fraction of a second, though he immediately dismissed the feeling as nothing more than distraction. The crowd's attention tightened further, sensing an invisible shift they could not name. Ava finally spoke again, her voice calm and measured, not directed at the crowd, not directed at fear, but directed at something beyond the moment itself. Ryan misunderstood it as defiance and raised his voice in response, attempting to reclaim control through volume, through presence, through repetition of authority. But the space around them no longer responded to him the same way. The black SUVs remained still, their occupants now visible but unmoving, watching rather than intervening. Ava's gaze briefly aligned with one of them, a silent acknowledgement passing without words. Ryan followed her line of sight for the first time, and a subtle change appeared in his expression as he noticed what had been forming behind him all along. The realization did not arrive as panic, but as confusion, the kind that forms when the structure of a situation stops matching expectation. Ava did not move. She did not need to. The moment had already begun shifting away from what Ryan believed he was controlling and towards something he had not yet been allowed to understand. And as the distance between assumption and reality began to collapse around him, the question that lingered in the charged silence was no longer about compliance or authority, but about what kind of truth had just quietly entered the scene without permission and what it was about to reveal next. The stillness that followed felt unnatural, as if the world itself had paused just long enough for something irreversible to begin forming beneath the surface of an ordinary street in downtown Houston. Officer Ryan Mitchell finally shifted his attention away from the woman in front of him, his eyes catching movement behind her, subtle but increasingly undeniable. The black SUVs that had appeared moments earlier were no longer distant shapes on the edge of awareness, but solid, deliberate presences positioned with precise intention. Doors remained closed, engines silent, yet their alignment suggested coordination rather than coincidence. Ava Johnson stood exactly where she had been since the beginning, her posture unchanged, her expression calm in a way that no longer felt passive but intentional. Ryan's confidence began to fracture at the edges, not all at once, but in small corrections of thought he did not yet fully recognize. He glanced back at the bystanders, expecting confusion or reassurance, but found instead a collective stillness that mirrored his own uncertainty. No one was speaking now. Even the act of recording had slowed, as though people were waiting for permission to understand what they were seeing. Ava's wrist device gave a faint pulse again, quieter than before, almost like a confirmation rather than a signal. Ryan stepped slightly to the side, attempting to regain a visual angle that made sense to him, but the perspective only deepened his uncertainty. The figures near the SUVs were now clearly visible, standing in a formation that suggested awareness rather than reaction, their attention directed not at the crowd, but at Ava. That detail settled heavily into the moment. Ava finally turned her head slightly, not toward Ryan, but toward the nearest vehicle, acknowledging something unspoken. The air seemed to tighten around that gesture, as if it carried meaning beyond what was visible. Ryan spoke again, but his voice no longer carried the same certainty it had before. It sounded measured, cautious in a way that contrasted sharply with his earlier authority. He demanded clarification, as if language alone could restore structure to what was slipping beyond his control. Ava did not respond immediately. Instead, she allowed the silence to expand, filling the space between them until it became the dominant force in the scene. One of the black SUVs finally opened its door. The movement was slow, deliberate, without urgency. A figure stepped out, dressed in a dark suit, posture straight, expression unreadable. No one moved to intervene yet. No one needed to. The presence alone shifted the atmosphere further. Ryan instinctively followed the movement, his earlier confidence now replaced with something less defined, something closer to uncertainty trying to find shape. Ava's eyes briefly met the approaching figure, and for the first time, there was acknowledgement that was not directed at confusion or resistance, but at timing. The bystanders seemed to sense the shift as well, their attention narrowing, their silence deepening. The figure from the SUV closed the distance slowly, stopping just within conversational range, not addressing the crowd, not addressing Ryan, but focusing entirely on Ava. The moment stretched, elongated by expectation. Ryan attempted once more to assert control through words, but his voice did not carry the same weight it had at the beginning. It felt increasingly disconnected from the structure of the moment itself. The figure finally spoke, calm and precise, identifying authorization codes that meant nothing to the crowd but changed the tone instantly for those who understood. Ava's expression remained steady, but now there was confirmation behind it, as if the final piece of a sequence had aligned. Ryan froze slightly, not in fear, but in recognition that something fundamental about his understanding of the situation was incomplete. The figure from the SUV stepped half a pace closer and stated clearly that the situation had been observed from the beginning, and that authority in this context did not belong where Ryan had assumed it did. Ava did not react outwardly, but the silence that followed carried a different weight now, one that no longer felt uncertain but decisive. Ryan looked between Ava and the arriving figure, searching for a framework that could restore order to what was unfolding, but none appeared. The crowd remained still, as if collectively realizing that they were no longer witnessing a confrontation, but the reveal of something far larger than the moment itself. And in that expanding silence, the question was no longer what Ryan had believed he was controlling, but how long it would take before he understood that the structure of authority he relied on had already been replaced by something he had never been trained to recognize. The moment after the authorization codes were spoken lingered in the air like a weight that refused to settle, as if reality itself had paused to decide what version of the situation would be allowed to continue. Officer Ryan Mitchell stood motionless, his earlier confidence now replaced with a kind of forced stillness that came from processing information too large to immediately categorize. The street around him, once filled with scattered attention and casual observation, had transformed into a focused silence where every small movement felt amplified. Ava Johnson remained exactly where she had been since the beginning, but something in the way she held herself had subtly changed, not in posture, but in presence, as though the environment was finally aligning with her instead of the other way around. The figure who had stepped from the black SUV maintained a steady position between Ava and Ryan, not blocking, not confronting, but establishing a boundary that was defined by authority, rather than force. Ryan attempted to reassert control through clarity, asking for confirmation in a tone that no longer carried the same certainty it had minutes earlier, but the response he received was not immediate. Instead, another vehicle door opened further down the line, and a second presence emerged, older, more deliberate in movement, carrying the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to environments where words were chosen carefully and consequences were already understood before they were spoken. The newcomer approached without urgency, scanning the scene once, not reacting to the crowd, not acknowledging the phone's recording every second, but focusing entirely on the alignment of individuals already present. When this second figure finally spoke, the tone was calm but absolute, identifying jurisdictional oversight that extended beyond local enforcement, and confirming that the situation had been under observation long before Ryan had arrived on the scene. The words were not dramatic, yet they carried a finality that shifted the structure of the moment itself. Ava finally moved her gaze from the distance and met the arriving figure directly, not with surprise, but with recognition that suggested this moment had been expected rather than discovered. Ryan, meanwhile, struggled to reconcile what he was hearing with what he had assumed only minutes earlier. The framework he had relied on, the structure that defined his role, began to feel incomplete, not invalid, but insufficient for the context unfolding around him. The second figure gestured slightly toward Ava, confirming identity in a manner that was formal rather than emotional, stating clearly that she was operating under a classification that required silence rather than explanation, and that her presence in this location had been part of a controlled sequence rather than an accidental encounter. The bystanders, still watching, began to shift in subtle ways, their understanding of the moment evolving from confusion to cautious realization that they were no longer observing a routine interaction. Ryan attempted one final time to stabilize the situation through procedural language, but his words now felt disconnected from the authority structure that had already been redefined around him. Ava remained composed, her expression unchanged, but the stillness around her now carried confirmation instead of uncertainty. The second figure turned slightly toward Ryan, not with hostility, but with professional detachment, acknowledging his role while simultaneously indicating its limits within the current context. The explanation that followed was brief but absolute, clarifying that operational command had already been activated prior to any local engagement, and that what Ryan had interpreted as enforcement was in fact observation of protocol continuity. In that moment, Ryan's understanding of authority shifted from something he participated in to something he had only partially perceived. Ava did not speak, but her silence now functioned differently, no longer as ambiguity, but as completion. The black SUVs remained in position, their presence no longer mysterious but structured, as though they had always been part of a larger design that was only now becoming visible. And as the realization settled across the scene like a slow horizon, the question that emerged was not about what would happen next, but about how long it would take for Ryan to understand that the moment he believed he was controlling had, in reality, already been concluded before he ever arrived. The silence that followed the last confirmation felt different from anything that had come before it, not empty, not tense, but structured, as if the environment itself had reorganized around a truth that was no longer waiting to be discovered but already established. Officer Ryan Mitchell stood in the same position, yet everything about how he occupied that space had changed, his earlier certainty now replaced with a careful stillness that came from realizing he was no longer the defining variable in the situation. Around him, the street no longer behaved like a public setting reacting to an incident, but like a controlled perimeter responding to a completed directive. The black SUVs remained aligned in the background, their presence no longer interpreted as interruption but as confirmation of an operational reality that had been active long before visible acknowledgement. Ava Johnson remained calm, her posture unchanged, but the calmness now carried a different meaning, no longer read as passive endurance, but as alignment with an invisible framework that had finally surfaced into view. The second figure who had spoken earlier maintained position, scanning the surroundings once more before briefly communicating through a discrete device, his tone low and precise, confirming status updates that were not meant for public interpretation. Ryan attempted to reassert conversational structure, asking questions that were now met with measured pauses rather than direct contradiction, each silence reinforcing the gap between assumption and reality. The second figure finally turned his attention fully toward Ryan, not with confrontation, but with clarity, explaining in controlled language that the engagement Ryan believed he initiated had actually been monitored from inception, and that his role within it had been observed as part of a wider evaluation protocol. Ava finally broke her stillness with a subtle shift of her gaze, acknowledging the exchange not as a participant seeking validation, but as someone confirming completion of a staged sequence. The bystanders, still present, no longer appeared confused. Instead, they were quiet in a way that suggested gradual comprehension, as if the meaning of what they had witnessed was only now settling into place. Ryan's breathing slowed slightly, not from relief but from cognitive recalibration, as he processed that the authority he had been exercising was not being opposed, but superseded by a structure he had never been briefed on. The second figure then clarified that Ava's classification required operational discretion at the highest level, and that any perception of routine enforcement was a misinterpretation of layered activity occurring beneath visible interaction. No raised voices followed this statement, no urgency, only confirmation. Ava took one small step forward, not toward Ryan, but toward the space between all present parties, as if closing a loop rather than initiating a change. Her expression remained composed, Yet the stillness around her now felt anchored, as though the environment had been waiting for her acknowledgement to finalize its own state. Ryan's earlier certainty had fully dissolved into structured uncertainty, replaced by an awareness that the rules he had been applying were not universal, but conditional to a system he had not been operating within. The black SUVs remained in position, their doors now closed again, signaling not departure, but containment of the moment within defined boundaries. The second figure concluded the explanation with a final clarification that no escalation had occurred, only exposure of alignment between observation and authorization layers. Ava did not respond verbally, but her silence carried confirmation that no further action was required from her perspective. The crowd remained motionless, not out of fear or confusion, but because the narrative they thought they were witnessing had already shifted into something else entirely, something structured, controlled, and already concluded before their understanding fully caught up. And as Ryan stood within that realization, the final and most unsettling thought that formed was not about what he had done, but about how long he had been participating in a system he had mistaken for something far smaller than what it actually was. The atmosphere had fully shifted into something that no longer resembled an unfolding confrontation, but instead felt like the closing phase of a process already defined long before any visible interaction began. Officer Ryan Mitchell remained standing in the same position, yet his presence in the scene now felt observational rather than central, as if the role he believed he held had been quietly reassigned without announcement. The second figure, still positioned between Ryan and Ava Johnson, maintained a composed stance, his attention alternating between subtle environmental checks and controlled communication through a discrete device. The black SUVs remained stationary, forming a quiet perimeter that no longer suggested arrival or intervention, but continuity of oversight. Ava stood with the same calm precision she had maintained from the beginning, her expression unchanged, yet the meaning behind her stillness had fully transformed in the perception of those now beginning to understand the structure of the moment. Ryan attempted once more to establish verbal control, asking for procedural clarity, but the response he received was not opposition or correction, but confirmation delivered in a tone that carried no urgency, because urgency no longer applied. The second figure explained with deliberate clarity that the sequence Ryan had interpreted as escalation had in fact been monitored as part of a controlled environment designed to observe behavioral response under specific conditions. The words were not dramatic, yet they carried weight because they redefined the entire framework of interpretation. Ava finally turned her attention fully toward the exchange, not as a subject within it, but as an acknowledged point of convergence within the system being described. The surrounding bystanders remained silent, their attention no longer fragmented by curiosity, but unified by the gradual realization that the event they had witnessed was not spontaneous interaction but structured alignment of roles. Ryan's expression shifted subtly as he processed the implication that his actions had been contained within parameters he had not been made aware of, and that his perceived authority had functioned only within a limited operational layer. The second figure continued without interruption, clarifying that Ava Johnson's presence in this environment was not incidental nor reactive, but consistent with an ongoing framework of classified oversight that operated independently of local enforcement structures. No dramatic emphasis accompanied this statement, only precision, as though stating conditions that were already established and required no validation. Ava's posture remained steady, but her silence now carried confirmation rather than ambiguity, reinforcing the idea that she was not reacting to the situation but completing it. The black SUVs remained unchanged, their stillness now interpreted not as waiting, but as completion of positioning within a predefined structure. Ryan's earlier certainty had fully dissolved into a measured awareness that what he had considered authority was only a surface function within a larger system that operated beyond his direct comprehension. The second figure concluded the explanation by stating that no further action was required from local units, as the situation had already transitioned beyond their operational scope. Ava did not respond verbally, but the subtle shift in her gaze indicated acknowledgement of closure within her own framework. The crowd remained present, but no longer reactive, their attention settling into quiet absorption as the meaning of what they had witnessed continued to unfold internally rather than externally. Ryan stood in stillness that no longer reflected control or resistance, but recognition that the structure surrounding him had never been defined by his understanding of it. And as the final layer of realization settled across the scene, the unspoken conclusion became clear without need for further explanation, that the moment had not escalated into something unexpected, but had instead revealed itself as something carefully contained from the very beginning, waiting only for recognition to complete its purpose. The final layer of silence that settled over the street no longer felt like uncertainty, but like completion, as if every participant in the scene had finally been aligned into positions that were decided long before any visible interaction began. Officer Ryan Mitchell stood still, no longer attempting to assert authority or reinterpret the situation, but instead processing the realization that his understanding had been confined to a fragment of a much larger operational structure. Around him, the bystanders remained quiet, their phones still raised but no longer shifting focus, as though instinctively aware that recording had transitioned from capturing an event to documenting a conclusion. Ava Johnson remained composed, her posture unchanged, yet the stillness around her now felt absolute, as if her presence had been the fixed point around which everything else had quietly reorganized. The second figure maintained his position, no longer issuing instructions or clarifications, but instead overseeing the final stabilization of the moment through subtle communication that suggested closure rather than continuation. The black SUVs, once perceived as an emerging development, now felt like a permanent perimeter that had simply become visible at the correct stage of understanding. Ryan finally exhaled in a controlled manner, his gaze lowering slightly as he processed the absence of any further procedural escalation. There were no raised voices, no corrective actions, no confrontation that would resolve the tension through familiar patterns. Instead, there was only structure, revealed in full after having been present from the beginning without recognition. The second figure spoke one final time, not to escalate or to instruct, but to confirm that all operational objectives tied to observation had been completed, and that no further engagement was required from local enforcement presence. The language was precise and restrained, reinforcing the idea that nothing about the situation had been improvised or reactive, but instead measured and contained. Ava's attention briefly shifted toward Ryan, not with judgment or dismissal, but with a calm acknowledgement that his role in the moment had reached its natural limit within the framework that had governed everything from the start. Ryan did not respond immediately, as there was no procedural language available to him that could redefine what he had already understood. The crowd remained still, their earlier curiosity now replaced with a quiet recognition that the moment they had witnessed was not an escalation toward chaos, but a controlled revelation of hierarchy that existed beyond their initial perception. The second figure took a step back, signaling through subtle movement that the active phase of observation had concluded. Ava did not move immediately, allowing the silence to settle fully before turning slightly toward the direction of the black SUVs, acknowledging completion without ceremony. Ryan remained where he was, not restrained, not instructed, but simply no longer positioned as an active participant within the structure that now defined the scene. The environment itself seemed to release tension not through resolution, but through acceptance that all necessary information had already been revealed. As the vehicles prepared for quiet departure, the final understanding that lingered across the entire street was not about conflict or confrontation, but about how reality can remain unchanged in appearance while completely transforming in meaning the moment its underlying structure is finally recognized. The quiet after departure did not feel like an ending, but rather like the final settling of dust after something far larger had already passed through the space without resistance. The street in downtown Houston slowly returned to motion, yet nothing felt the same about it, as if the ordinary rhythm of traffic and footsteps had been subtly rewritten by what had just occurred. Officer Ryan Mitchell remained standing for several seconds longer than necessary, not because he was waiting for instruction, but because his internal sense of sequence no longer aligned with what his environment was telling him. There was no escalation, no resolution in the traditional sense, only closure delivered through absence of further action. The black SUVs that had defined the perimeter moments earlier began to move with quiet coordination, their departure as controlled as their arrival, each vehicle leaving without drawing attention, without urgency, as if their purpose had never been to disrupt, but only to confirm. Ava Johnson stood at the center of the space they had vacated, her presence now fully integrated into the environment rather than contrasted against it. The second figure, who had maintained structured authority throughout the encounter, gave a final subtle acknowledgement before stepping back and dissolving into the departing formation, leaving no remaining ambiguity about the completion of their role. Ryan finally lowered his gaze toward the ground for a moment, not in defeat, but in recalibration, as though trying to map what he had experienced onto a framework that no longer supported it. The bystanders, still present but no longer reactive, began to lower their phones one by one, not because they had lost interest, but because the moment they thought they were documenting had transformed into something that resisted simple categorization. Ava took a slow step forward, not toward Ryan, not toward the crowd, but toward the open space that remained after the vehicles had gone, as if acknowledging that the structure of the moment now belonged to a different phase entirely. The air itself seemed lighter, yet more defined, like pressure had been removed, but meaning had been added. Ryan finally spoke, but his voice carried none of the authority it had earlier in the day. Instead, it reflected an attempt to understand rather than to control. There was no response directed at correction or discipline, only silence that confirmed the absence of need for further interpretation. Ava's expression remained steady, but there was a clarity in her gaze now that suggested completion rather than concealment, as if every layer of what had occurred had already fulfilled its intended function. The street returned gradually to normal activity, but normal no longer meant unchanged. It meant adjusted to awareness of something that could not be unseen. Ryan remained in place for a final moment before stepping back toward his patrol unit, no longer engaged in enforcement posture, but in quiet reflection that had no procedural outlet. The crowd slowly dispersed, each person carrying away a version of the moment that would not fully align with any official explanation. And as Ava finally turned away and walked forward without urgency, the final realization that lingered across the entire scene was not about authority or identity, but about how easily perception can remain fixed even after the true structure of a moment has already shifted into something entirely different, leaving only awareness behind in its place. The city felt normal again on the surface, but beneath that surface something had permanently shifted, like an invisible recalibration that no one could point to, but everyone now instinctively felt. Downtown Houston continued its daily rhythm with traffic lights cycling and pedestrians moving in predictable patterns, yet the memory of what had unfolded still lingered in the collective awareness of those who had witnessed it. Officer Ryan Mitchell sat inside his patrol unit for several moments longer than necessary, not because he was assigned to remain, but because his sense of procedural clarity had not fully reassembled itself after what he had experienced. There was no report to file that could fully capture the structure of what had occurred, no category in his training that accounted for the absence of escalation where escalation had been expected. Across the street, Ava Johnson continued walking at a steady pace, no longer surrounded by vehicles or figures of authority, yet carrying a presence that no longer needed confirmation. The earlier silence that had defined the encounter now transformed into something else entirely, not emptiness, but resolution without explanation. Ryan eventually started the engine of his patrol unit, but even that simple action felt disconnected from the sequence of events that had preceded it. The world outside his window no longer aligned with the internal model he had used to interpret it just minutes earlier. Ava did not look back as she walked, not because she was avoiding anything, but because there was nothing left to verify. The second figure and the black SUVs had already disappeared from visible space, leaving behind no trace of urgency or disruption, only the subtle impression that their presence had never been about reaction, but confirmation of something already complete. The bystanders slowly dispersed across sidewalks and intersections, their conversations fragmented, their interpretations varying, yet all anchored by the shared understanding that what they had seen did not fit into ordinary expectation. Some replayed moments on their devices, others simply walked in silence, but none of them treated the experience as something that could be fully summarized in simple terms. Ryan finally pulled away from the curb, merging back into traffic, yet his attention remained divided between the physical road ahead and the unresolved structure of what had just concluded. There was no pursuit, no further instruction, no corrective action following him. Only the lingering realization that his role in the situation had ended without the resolution he had been conditioned to expect. Ava continued forward through the city, passing intersections and storefronts that resumed their normal appearance, yet her presence no longer blended into the environment in the same way it had before. The earlier confrontation, the arrival of structured authority, and the quiet withdrawal of forces that had defined the perimeter now existed as a completed sequence, not as an active event. The final understanding that remained across all observers was not about conflict or compliance, but about how perception itself can remain fixed even after the underlying structure of reality has already shifted into a state that no longer requires explanation to sustain itself. The city had already returned to its rhythm, yet beneath that rhythm something irreversible continued to echo, not as sound, but as understanding settling into places where certainty used to live. Officer Ryan Mitchell drove through the streets of Houston with both hands on the wheel, but his attention was no longer fully anchored to the road in front of him. Traffic lights changed, pedestrians crossed, engines passed, yet everything felt slightly out of alignment, as if the world had continued normally, while his internal reference point had shifted without warning. There was no official explanation waiting for him, no report template that could translate what he had witnessed into something familiar. Only the lingering realization that the structure he once relied on for clarity no longer responded to his assumptions in the same way. Meanwhile, several blocks away, Ava Johnson moved through the city with steady precision, no longer surrounded by vehicles or figures of authority, yet still carrying an unmistakable presence that seemed to shape the space around her rather than simply occupy it. People passed her on sidewalks without recognizing anything unusual. Yet those who had witnessed the earlier sequence could not fully detach from the memory of how quickly perception had changed when unseen structure became visible. Ryan eventually slowed at a red light and sat still longer than necessary, not because he was waiting for anything in particular, but because his mind was attempting to reconcile two versions of reality that no longer aligned cleanly. The first was the version he had acted within, defined by direct authority and immediate interpretation, and the second was the version that had revealed itself only after that authority had already been superseded by something broader, quieter, and far more structured. Ava, on the other hand, continued forward without hesitation, her steps measured not by urgency, but by completion, as though she had already passed through the part of the day that required acknowledgement and was now simply moving beyond it. There was no pursuit, no lingering perimeter, no visible trace of the black SUVs or the second figure who had spoken with such precision earlier, yet their absence did not feel like disappearance. It felt like closure. Ryan finally exhaled slowly at the intersection, the light turning green without immediate response from him, as if even simple transitions now required additional processing. When he finally drove forward, the movement was smooth, but his awareness remained divided between external navigation and internal reconstruction of meaning. The bystanders who had witnessed the earlier moment were now scattered across the city, each carrying fragments of interpretation that would never fully align into a single narrative, yet all of them aware that what they had seen did not behave like ordinary escalation or resolution. Ava stopped briefly at a corner, not to reflect, but to recalibrate direction, and in that pause there was no tension, only completion. Ryan passed through another intersection, and for a brief moment, he caught sight of her in the distance, continuing forward without looking back, not as someone leaving a scene, but as someone who had already moved beyond its relevance. And in that quiet separation between movement and understanding, the final realization settled without announcement, that what had unfolded earlier in the day was never about confrontation at all, but about the moment when perception itself is quietly replaced by structure that was always present, waiting only for recognition to become complete. The city continued its motion without pause, Yet beneath its ordinary rhythm, there was a lingering sense that something fundamental had already been altered in ways that could not be reversed by simple passage of time. Officer Ryan Mitchell drove through Houston in relative silence, the interior of his vehicle filled only with the low hum of the engine and the occasional shift of traffic around him. Yet his thoughts remained distant from the physical road ahead. Every intersection he passed seemed to echo with fragments of what he had witnessed earlier, not as dramatic memory, but as structural inconsistency in how he now interpreted authority, control, and sequence of events. Ava Johnson, several blocks away, continued walking with steady purpose, her pace unchanged, her expression calm, and her presence no longer framed by the tension of earlier observation, but by something quieter and more definitive. There was no urgency in her movement, only continuity, as though the events of the day had already reached their intended conclusion and everything afterward was simply extension. Ryan eventually slowed near another intersection, allowing his vehicle to come to a complete stop even though the light had already turned green, his delay not caused by distraction, but by internal recalibration that lacked immediate resolution. The version of reality he had operated within earlier no longer aligned with what he had since been exposed to, and the gap between those two understandings continued to widen in subtle ways that could not be resolved through logic alone. Meanwhile, Ava crossed another street, her attention forward, not reflective, but resolved, as though she had already processed every layer of the situation and moved beyond its relevance. The city around her remained unchanged in appearance, yet the meaning embedded within it felt slightly different to those who had witnessed even a portion of what had transpired earlier. Ryan finally continued driving, but his awareness remained divided, one part focused on navigation, the other still attempting to reconcile how quickly perceived authority could be reframed without visible escalation or resistance. There was no pursuit, no remaining formation of vehicles, no presence of the second figure who had previously articulated structure with such precision, yet their absence no longer felt like disappearance, but like completion of function. Ava paused briefly near a pedestrian crossing, waiting for signal change, her posture unchanged, her expression neutral, yet her stillness carried the kind of finality that did not require reinforcement. Ryan passed another block and briefly caught sight of her again through passing traffic, but this time there was no attempt at interpretation, only recognition that she was no longer part of any unresolved sequence in his understanding. The bystanders who had witnessed earlier moments were now dispersed throughout the city, each carrying fragments of interpretation that no longer required external validation, because what they had seen had already redefined their internal reference of what authority and structure could appear like when fully revealed. Ava stepped forward when the light changed, continuing along the sidewalk without hesitation, not leaving anything behind, but simply moving beyond the need for anything further to be defined. Ryan finally exhaled more fully as he drove through another intersection, no longer searching for explanation, but gradually accepting that some experiences do not resolve into clarity through repetition, but instead settle into understanding through absence of contradiction. And in that gradual, quiet separation between movement and meaning, the final realization that remained was not about what had happened earlier in the day, but about how easily the appearance of control can exist unchanged on the surface, while the underlying structure has already shifted into something entirely complete long before anyone recognizes it has ended. The final stretch of the day unfolded across Houston with a sense of quiet normalization, yet beneath that surface there remained a subtle residue of everything that had shifted earlier, as if the city had returned to routine while still carrying an invisible awareness of what had been revealed. Officer Ryan Mitchell sat in a stationary position inside his vehicle for a long moment before making any movement, his hands resting on the steering wheel without urgency. His attention no longer focused on patrol duties, but on the internal processing of events that had fundamentally altered his understanding of structure and authority. There was no active directive waiting for him, no immediate assignment requiring response. Only the lingering awareness that his participation in the earlier sequence had concluded without the resolution he had once expected. Meanwhile, across the city blocks, Ava Johnson continued forward through pedestrian traffic, her pace unchanged, her expression steady, and her presence no longer defined by external observation, but by internal completion of whatever process had brought her into that moment earlier in the day. She crossed another intersection without hesitation, blending into the flow of the city while still carrying an unmistakable sense of finality in her movement. Ryan eventually drove forward, not toward any specific destination tied to the earlier incident, but as part of routine continuation, though even routine now felt slightly redefined in his perception. The formal structure of law enforcement interaction, which he had always understood as direct and linear, now appeared layered in ways he had not previously considered, and that realization settled into him gradually rather than all at once. Back at the precinct level of administration, reports had already begun circulating through internal channels regarding the encounter, not framed as escalation, but as a structured operational review requiring documentation and clarification of jurisdictional overlap. The language used in those reports remained procedural, yet the implications extended beyond routine classification, signaling that the event had been recorded within a system far broader than street-level interpretation. Ryan was not summoned, not reprimanded in any immediate sense, and not engaged in confrontation. Instead, his involvement was logged, reviewed, and placed within a framework that emphasized oversight rather than reaction. Ava, on the other hand, was no longer present in any visible operational capacity within the city's immediate awareness. Her earlier appearance now categorized within secure channels that did not intersect with public understanding. The second figure who had previously spoken with measured authority had also fully withdrawn from visible context, leaving no trace of continued engagement. As the afternoon transitioned toward evening, Ryan finally parked his vehicle at the end of his shift cycle, remaining seated for several moments longer than usual, not due to hesitation, but due to the absence of immediate mental resolution. He understood, without needing further explanation, that what had occurred earlier was not an interruption of order, but an exposure of a structure that operated beyond his normal scope of recognition. Ava's final image in his memory was not one of confrontation or conflict, but of steady movement forward, unimpeded and deliberate, as if she had already completed every necessary layer of engagement long before anyone else had fully understood what was unfolding. And in that quiet separation between duty and realization, between action and understanding, the final truth that remained was not about authority or control, but about how often systems appear unchanged until a single moment reveals that they were operating on a level that was always present, always active, and only waiting for recognition to make it visible. The city had fully returned to its normal rhythm, yet beneath that normality there remained a subtle, almost invisible shift in how it felt to those who had been even briefly touched by what had unfolded earlier. Houston moved through its evening hours with traffic flowing along familiar routes, storefronts lighting up in predictable patterns, and pedestrians continuing their lives without visible interruption. But for a small number of individuals, the memory of that day remained structured in a way that did not fade into background noise. Officer Ryan Mitchell completed his shift in silence, no longer replaying the events with confusion, but with a quiet, steady acceptance that what he had witnessed was not a disruption of order, but an exposure of layers of order he had never been trained to recognize. There was no report that could fully contain the experience, no formal documentation that could reduce it to a single interpretation, and in that absence of simplicity, understanding took a different form, slower and more reflective. Ava Johnson, now far removed from the location where the encounter had taken place, continued her movement through the city without urgency, her presence no longer defined by the roles others attempted to assign to her in passing moments, but by a stillness that suggested completion rather than concealment. She did not look back, not out of avoidance, but because nothing remained unresolved in the direction she had come from. The second figure and the structured presence that had accompanied the earlier sequence were no longer visible within the city's immediate environment, yet their impact lingered not as memory of action, but as recognition of framework. Across different parts of Houston, those who had witnessed the earlier interaction carried forward fragmented interpretations, each shaped by personal perspective, yet all sharing an underlying acknowledgement that what they had seen did not behave like ordinary cause and effect. Ryan, sitting later in a quiet parking area near the precinct, reflected not on individual decisions, but on the realization that perception itself can be limited by the boundaries of assumed structure, and that those boundaries often remain invisible until they are crossed without warning. There was no dramatic resolution, no final confrontation to define meaning, only the gradual settling of awareness that some systems do not reveal themselves through escalation, but through stillness that follows it. Ava, in contrast, had already moved beyond the need for interpretation, her path continuing through familiar streets that no longer carried the weight of recent events. The city around her had resumed its ordinary identity, yet the layers beneath that identity now felt subtly different, as if the surface of routine had been momentarily lifted and then carefully placed back without disturbance. Ryan eventually left the vehicle and walked toward the precinct entrance, his steps steady, not burdened, but measured by thought rather than reaction. There was no conclusion that demanded declaration, only the recognition that understanding had expanded beyond the limits of initial assumption. And as the night settled fully over Houston, the final impression left by the day was not one of disruption or resolution, but of quiet realization that reality often remains unchanged in appearance even after its underlying structure has already shifted into something more complete than what first meets the